January 28, 2026, 4:47 a.m. Arctic Ocean, 200 miles north of Russia's Kola Peninsula. The USS Montana, a Virginia-class attack submarine, sits at 400 feet depth in freezing water, silent, invisible, monitoring the largest Russian naval exercise in 5 years. 12 Russian warships conducting coordinated operations, testing tactics, testing weapons, testing communications, and the Montana is recording everything. Every radio transmission, every sonar ping, every tactical maneuver, standard intelligence gathering, standard Cold War tactics in modern era. The crew has done this dozens of times, observed Russian exercises, collected signals intelligence, returned home with data that helps US Navy understand Russian capabilities. Routine mission, routine day. Then the Montana's sonar operator hears something that shouldn't exist. Active sonar. Russian. Close. Very close. Pinging directly at the submarine's position. The Russians have detected them. Somehow. Despite every stealth technology. Despite perfect positioning. Despite decades of silent running expertise, the Russians know an American submarine is there, and 8 Russian warships with anti-submarine warfare helicopters are about to begin a hunt that will last 72 hours. A hunt through Arctic waters. A game of cat and mouse where the mouse is trapped in enemy territory, where escape means crossing hundreds of miles of ocean while being pursued by vessels specifically designed to find and kill submarines, where one mistake means capture or destruction, where 3 days of evasion will reveal whether American submarine stealth still works against Russian detection, and why those 72 hours will expose something about Russian submarine communications that changes everything about undersea warfare. The numbers seem impossible. 1 American submarine against 8 Russian warships. 1 vessel with 130 crew against 8 vessels with over 2,000 sailors combined. 1 target against dozens of sonar systems and anti-submarine helicopters. Trapped in Arctic waters 200 miles from international space. With limited battery power, limited oxygen, limited time, the tactical situation is catastrophic. The Montana should surface, should declare emergency, should accept diplomatic incident rather than risk destruction. But surfacing means revealing American submarine capabilities, means exposing sensors and systems, means intelligence failure, means admitting defeat. Commander Sarah Mitchell refuses that outcome. She'll evade. She'll escape. She'll bring her submarine home with the intelligence they came for, or she'll die trying. Because that's what submarine commanders do. They don't surrender. They don't surface when hunted. They evade. They hide. They use every advantage their boat possesses. They trust their training. They trust their technology. They trust their crew. And they survive. Somehow. Always. But this story isn't about a survival. It's about what the Montana was really doing there. About what intelligence they were gathering. And why the Russians were so desperate to find them that they committed 8 warships to the hunt. Stay with me. Because what happens in the next 72 hours reveals everything about modern submarine warfare. About the limits of stealth. And about what both sides are willing to risk for intelligence that changes balance of power beneath the ocean. Commander Sarah Mitchell had been captain of USS Montana for 18 months. This was her 4th deployment to Arctic waters. She knew these seas, knew the underwater terrain, knew where cold currents created thermal layers that hid submarines, knew where underwater canyons provided concealment, knew how to use the environment, but she'd never been detected before. Never had Russians actively hunting her submarine. The sonar contact was unmistakable. Russian destroyer. 5 miles away, active sonar pinging, and the ping pattern indicated they weren't searching randomly. They were tracking a specific target. They were tracking Montana. Somehow they knew. Somehow they'd found the one American submarine in thousands of square miles of Arctic Ocean. That shouldn't be possible. Montana's anechoic coating absorbed sonar. Her machinery was silenced. Her reactor shielded. She was designed to be invisible, was tested to be invisible, was proven to be invisible, until now. Until somehow Russians had found her anyway. Mitchell's first decision was critical. All stop. Rig for ultra quiet. All non-essential systems offline. We're going silent. The Montana's engines stopped. The submarine drifted. Silent. Dark. Only essential systems operating. Life support. Navigation. Passive sonar listening. Nothing that made noise. Nothing that created heat signatures. Nothing that Russians could detect. The crew moved slowly, carefully. Every sound mattered. Every vibration traveled through water. Every mistake meant detection. This was what they trained for. This was the scenario every submarine crew dreaded, being hunted in enemy waters, with nowhere to hide except the ocean itself, with no support, no rescue, just themselves and their submarine and their training and hope that stealth would work, that Russians would lose contact, that Montana could disappear again, become invisible again, the way submarines are supposed to be. At 5:15 a.m., 30 minutes after first detection, the Russian destroyer was 3 miles away, still pinging, still tracking. Montana hadn't moved, hadn't made sound, but Russians still had contact, still knew where the submarine was. That meant they weren't using sonar alone. They had something else, something new. Mitchell studied the tactical display. Russian destroyer maintaining position, not approaching closer, not launching weapons, just tracking, like they were confirming something, like they were testing something, like Montana was experiment. That realization was chilling. Russians hadn't accidentally detected Montana. They'd been looking for her. They'd known an American submarine was there, had used new detection method to find her, were now proving it worked, were demonstrating to their own navy that American stealth submarines weren't invisible anymore. That Russian technology could find them, track them, kill them if needed. At 6 a.m., 2 hours after detection, 3 more Russian warships joined the hunt. Frigate, another destroyer, corvette, all equipped with anti-submarine warfare systems, all positioning around Montana, creating perimeter, trapping the American submarine in a box of Russian warships. Mitchell saw the pattern. They weren't trying to sink Montana. They were trying to force her to surface, to create diplomatic crisis, to prove they'd caught American submarines spying on Russian exercises, to embarrass US Navy, to demonstrate Russian superiority. That changed the calculation. Mitchell couldn't surface, couldn't give Russians that victory, had to escape, had to evade, had to prove American submarines could still disappear even after being detected, had to show that finding submarine and keeping track of submarine were different things. At 7:30 a.m., Mitchell made her move. Helm, ahead 1/3, course 090, make your depth 600 feet, silent running. Montana began moving, slowly, quietly, descending deeper, heading east, away from Russian exercise area, away from enemy warships. toward international waters 200 miles away. The Russian destroyer tracking them reacted immediately. Increased speed, closed distance, active sonar intensified. But Montana was descending, going deeper than surface ships could effectively track, using thermoclines and salinity layers to mask her acoustic signature, using underwater terrain to break line of sight, using every trick in submarine warfare playbook. The Russians followed, adjusted, but their tracking became less precise. Montana was fading from their sensors, becoming ghost again. This was submarine warfare, not shooting, not violence, just hide and seek at 600 feet depth, where pressure crushed human body, where sunlight never reached, where only sonar and skill determined who won, who survived, who escaped. At 10 a.m., 5 hours into the hunt, Russians deployed helicopters, anti-submarine Ka-27s, equipped with dipping sonar and sonobuoys. The helicopters could search areas surface ships couldn't reach, could hover over suspected positions and lower sonar arrays, could create detection grid that trapped submarines. Montana's passive sonar detected the helicopters, counted 6. They were creating search pattern, systematic, professional, covering every square mile, dropping sonobuoys that transmitted active sonar, creating acoustic fence that Montana would have to cross. Mitchell studied the pattern, found gaps, small, narrow, but gaps existed. Windows where Montana could slip through undetected. Timing was critical. Speed was critical. Silence was critical. Everything was critical. One mistake meant detection, meant 3 more days of being hunted, meant possibly never escaping. At 12:30 p.m., Montana approached the sonobuoy line. Mitchell had chosen a gap, narrow corridor between 2 buoys, 2-mile-wide corridor. Montana was 360 feet long, 33 feet wide. She'd fit, barely. But speed through the gap meant noise, meant detection, meant alerting Russians to her escape attempt. Mitchell chose compromise. Ahead 2/3 for 30 seconds, then all stop and drift. Montana accelerated. Brief burst of speed. Crossed the gap in the sonobuoy line, then stopped. Drifted silent. The sonobuoys detected something. Russians responded. Helicopters converged. But by the time they arrived, Montana was 2 miles past the line. Silent. Drifting. Invisible again. The Russians searched. Found nothing. Montana had slipped through. Had broken the first containment. But Russians weren't giving up. They were adapting, learning, adjusting tactics. This was just beginning. 72 hours of this, 3 days of cat and mouse, of hiding and seeking, of American ingenuity against Russian determination. At 6 p.m., 13 hours into the hunt, Mitchell faced new problem. Battery power. Montana was nuclear powered, could run indefinitely. But silent running meant minimal reactor output, meant running on batteries, and batteries were depleting. She had maybe 48 hours of battery power remaining. After that, she'd need to increase reactor output, make more noise, become more detectable. Russians were counting on this, were maintaining pressure, forcing Montana to stay quiet, forcing her to drain batteries, creating timeline where submarine would eventually have to make noise, have to become detectable, have to be found. Mitchell understood the game, understood she was being outweighted, but she also understood submarines, understood that 48 hours was enough to reach international waters, enough to escape Russian territory, enough to win. If she was smart, if she was patient, if she was lucky. At 11:00 p.m., 18 hours into the hunt, Russians tried new tactic: depth charges. Not close, not attempting to sink Montana, but close enough to be threatening, close enough to rattle the crew, close enough to force mistakes. Psychological warfare, stress, creating fear, making American sailors second guess, making them nervous, making them make errors. But Mitchell's crew was trained for this, was prepared for this. Depth charges exploded. Shockwaves hit Montana's hull. Crew felt the impacts, felt the fear, but held discipline, maintained silence, continued mission. Because this was what submarine warfare was. Not glorious combat, not heroic battles, just endurance, just patience, just surviving while enemy tried to find you, tried to force you up, tried to make you quit, and refusing, always refusing. That's what submariners did. They endured. At 8 a.m., on day 2, 32 hours into the hunt, Montana was 120 miles from international waters, halfway to safety. But Russians hadn't given up. 8 warships were still searching. Helicopters still dropping sonar buoys. The net was tighter now, more systematic. Russians had refined their search pattern, had adapted to Montana's evasion tactics, were predicting where submarine would go, were positioning to intercept. Mitchell saw it developing, saw the trap being set, and made decision that would determine whether Montana escaped. She stopped running, stopped heading towards safety. Instead, she turned back, toward Russian exercise area, toward the place Russians had already searched, toward the last place they'd expect American submarine to go. It was counterintuitive, risky, brilliant, or suicidal, depending on whether it worked. The maneuver surprised Russians. They'd been tracking Montana's eastward movement, had positioned to intercept. When submarine disappeared from predicted course, they assumed she'd gone deeper, gone quieter. They searched ahead, found nothing. Expanded search, found nothing. Montana had vanished. Because she wasn't ahead, she was behind, in areas already searched, in waters already cleared, hiding in plain sight, or in already searched sight. This was chess, 3-dimensional underwater chess, where pieces moved through depth and time and currents, where victory meant not being found, where survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead. Mitchell was grandmaster. Russians were learning that. At 4 p.m., on day 2, 47 hours into the hunt, batteries were critical. Montana had maybe 12 hours remaining. Mitchell had to make decision: continue hiding and risk running out of power, or increase reactor output, make noise, and run for international waters at high speed. Both options had risks. Both could fail. She chose speed. Ahead full. Course 090. Make your depth 400 feet. We're running. Montana's reactor increased output. Propeller turned faster. Speed increased to 35 knots. Fast for submarine. Faster than most surface ships. But noisy. Very noisy. Russians detected immediately. All 8 warships turned toward Montana's position. The race was on. 120 miles to international waters. 4 hours at current speed. If Montana could maintain speed, if reactor performed, if nothing broke, if Russians didn't cut her off. Too many ifs, but no choice. Batteries were dead. Speed was only option. This was endgame. Final sprint. Montana running. Russians chasing. Everything depending on next 4 hours. At 6 p.m., Russians were gaining. Surface ships could make 40 knots. Were faster than Montana. Were closing. would intercept before submarine reached international waters. Mitchell needed equalizer. Deploy decoys, program them to match our signature, and continue on course. We're changing direction. Montana launched acoustic decoys, devices that mimicked submarines' sound profile, made it seem like Montana was continuing east, while actual submarine turned northeast, different course. Russians tracked the decoys, followed the false signatures, committed ships to intercept. By the time they realized deception, Montana had gained 30 miles. 30 miles closer to safety, 30 miles closer to escape. But Russians weren't finished. They split their forces. Some pursued decoys, others searched for real submarine. Montana was running out of tricks, running out of luck, running out of ocean. At 8 p.m., on day 3, 63 hours into the hunt, Montana crossed into international waters, Norwegian Sea, NATO territory. Safety. Russians couldn't follow, couldn't attack, couldn't force Montana to surface. International law prevented it. Montana had escaped. He'd evaded 8 warships for 72 hours, had proven American submarine stealth still worked, had proven one submarine could outwit entire Russian anti-submarine force, had proven training and technology and courage could overcome numbers and determination. Mitchell radioed home. Mission complete. Montana has cleared Russian waters. All crew safe. Intelligence gathered successfully. The response was immediate. Outstanding work, Montana. Come home. 72 hours of tension released. Crew celebrated. Quietly. Professionally. But celebrated. They'd survived. They'd escaped. They'd won. But here's what the celebration missed. Here's what Mitchell's crew didn't know until debriefing. Here's what 72 hours of evasion had really accomplished. And why Russians had been so desperate to catch Montana. Why they'd committed 8 warships. Why they'd hunted for 3 days. Why this mission mattered more than anyone aboard understood. Montana hadn't been monitoring Russian exercises. That was cover story. Secondary mission. Real mission was different. Was classified. Was critical. Montana had been tracking new Russian submarine, ballistic missile submarine, newest class, equipped with new communication system, low-frequency system that could reach submarines anywhere in world, could coordinate Russian submarine fleet, could enable first strike capability. NATO needed to understand the system, needed to intercept communications, needed Montana to get close, to record, to analyze. Mission was successful. Montana had intercepted hours of Russian submarine communications, had recorded encryption, had identified frequency, had gathered intelligence that would let NATO decrypt Russian submarine orders, that would let Western forces track Russian ballistic missile submarines, that would maintain strategic nuclear balance. That's what 72 hours of being hunted accomplished. That's why Montana couldn't surface, couldn't be captured, couldn't let Russians know the real mission, had to escape with intelligence, had to bring it home, had to succeed, because failure meant Russians changing communication system, meant losing intelligence advantage, meant months or years of work wasted. Mitchell had known this, had understood stakes, had accepted risk, had fought for 3 days, had evaded 8 warships, had escaped, had succeeded. That's why she's commander. That's why Montana had been chosen. That's why 72 hours mattered. Not because submarine escaped, but because intelligence came home. Because NATO now understood Russian submarine communications. Because strategic balance was maintained. Because one submarine with one commander and 130 crew accomplished mission that affected entire undersea warfare domain. That's submarine service. That's what they do. Not glory, not recognition, just missions that matter, executed perfectly, in silence, underwater, where nobody sees, where nobody knows, except those who need to know. That's enough. That's everything. The 72 hours changed submarine warfare, proved American stealth still worked, proved Russian detection wasn't perfect, proved human skill mattered as much as technology, proved submarine commanders could outwit surface fleets, proved training was worth investment, proved Virginia-class submarines were most capable in world, proved US Navy's submarine force was still superior, proved that even when detected, American submarines could escape. That's what 72 hours demonstrated. That's what mission accomplished. That's what Mitchell commanded. That's what Montana achieved. 3 days of being hunted, 3 days of evasion, 3 days that proved everything about American submarine superiority and brought home intelligence that ensures that superiority continues. That's victory. That's success. That's why submarines exist. Not to fight, not to sink ships, but to gather intelligence, to survive when discovered, to escape when trapped, to complete mission despite everything. Montana did that. Mitchell commanded it. Crew executed it. That's all that matters. That's all that's remembered. 72 hours, Arctic Ocean, 1 submarine, 8 warships, American ingenuity, Russian determination. Final score: America wins. Submarine escapes. Intelligence secured. Mission complete. Forever.